Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, we're going to make fabric beads. Now, some people make an abundance of these and use these to make fabric jewelry. I like to make them individual. I take my time and I make a very interesting bead based on the fabric or ribbon that I use. I like to use the bead as an accessory in my work, and I showed how I was going to use this in a previous video, and that's what spurred this video for creating this bead, just to show you how I make this accessory. So let's get started making these beads. So these are some of the fabric beads that I make that I showed in a previous video. I use them as embellishments. I know some people make these beautiful fabric beads and they'll make multiple versions of them and use them as a necklace or some type of jewelry. I like to make individual masterpieces and just use them individually. I like to use it as an embellishment, but you can use it however you like. Now I have 3 different methods here. I'm going to show you all of them today. They're all based on the same premise, the same method. They're quite enjoyable to make. They're a little time consuming, but I do think they make a really stellar embellishment. And as you can see, so I have just a little thick wire here, you can actually string them. Some sides are easier to string than others, but they all string very nicely. So they do function as beads, and you certainly can make them as such. I like to make them and I'll either add additional elements, I'll string them along with other beads, or I'll just attach them to my project. And because they're made of fabric, they're very soft and they have a lot of give. So I really think this is a cute method. I have a previous method for making some beads, and I'll link that video below, but this is a different one. So let me get started and show you how I make these beads. So to make these beads, I like to use a felt base. You can use craft felt or wool felt, whatever you like. Felt comes in lots of colors. Today I'm going to use these 2 pieces to make it, so that's why I chose the red felt. I like to use ribbon. Now, one of the key points to why I like to use ribbon, particularly beautiful ribbon like this, is because the edges are finished. But you don't have to be limited by just using finished ribbon, although it comes in such beautiful textures and colors and patterns. It's very tempting to use this. This is just upholstery fabric. You can use just regular cotton fabric too, but the upholstery fabric, this one has a sheen in it, and this one has just an interesting texture. And you only need a small scrap to make your bead. You can make your beads as long and as fat as you want, or as small and thin. This one's going to make a very short little bead, and that's totally okay. You can also extend it further with your felt, and I'll show you some ways to do that as well. I like to use pearl thread just for a few stitches to connect my bead to shut it, and then I use beautiful embroidery floss on the edges. It gives like a very pretty satin finish for the edge. And lastly, this is a straw, pretty durable straw, just because it has that opening. You can use any type of straw. You can use a bamboo skewer. It really depends on how thick you want your bead to be. So now to get started, I start with my felt. Now ultimately the felt will decide the length of the bead. Even though this is a rather narrow fabric for the bead, I can have a lot of border on it. So I could take this fabric, and I could always double it up if I wanted. I'm just going to use a single strand, shall we say. But if I wanted to have a larger bead, I'd have a thicker border with my felt. I like to have just a little bit of felt peeking out, maybe a 1/4 inch or less on each side. And I don't really need a long piece of felt, so I'll turn it to the side. Now I have my ribbon here, and just for an idea, I'll probably cut it to this length for the actual length of my bead. And I don't even need it this long. So I'll probably cut it about half. I think I could probably get 2 beads out of this. One is a little longer than the other, and that's totally fine. I'll even use a shorter one to show you how I do it. To that end, I need just a little bit of ribbon as well. So I like to have about as much ribbon as I have felt, but you can play around with that as well. I start by taking my felt and just rolling it around whatever I'm going to use to make the bead shape. In this case, it's my straw. It can be a bamboo skewer as well. You can pin it down or add a little dab of glue if you want, but I just hold it down with my finger. And then I place my ribbon on top of it. And if I was using upholstery fabric or any fabric, I would put that on top. And then I just put the ribbon down just over it. Now this ribbon has a little frayed edge, so I'll just trim that off. My size here is very forgiving, so that I have a lot of give to it. So I'll just make sure that that bead is on snugly, that felt is on snugly. Not too tight, but not loose either. I don't want any wrinkles. And then I can just put my ribbon on top, figure that it's evenly spaced, wrap it around and hold it in place. Then I like to take my pearl thread, threaded it on my needle already, and I'll come up from the bottom. And I'm coming up from the bottom through all the layers of felt, just to the top through that ribbon, not worrying about the tail just yet. Then I'll come down, and I can even slide my bead to the end, so only part of it is on the straw. And I'm just going to make a few stitches to hold it down. I'm coming back in. I'm just worrying about tacking it down now, not aesthetics here. I'm using the black thread so you can see it, but I also don't mind the little stitches showing. Once I have that thread from the end of the ribbon all tacked down, I'll slide it back onto the straw, just working it around. Bring the thread to wherever the seam of the felt is. That happens to be pretty close to the seam of the ribbon, but it doesn't have to be. And now I'm just going to thread a few more stitches just to lock it in place. I don't have to go the length of the piece. I can just switch it now to the other end. And I'll just tack it down again. And from here, I'll just knot it off. Again, I keep it on the straw, just at the very edge. I'll make a small little knot. It will be hidden. And then I'll snip it and the long tail off. So that's a very basic bead. You could stop there if you want, but I don't want to. I want to embellish it a little further. So I'll just play around, making sure that that ribbon and the felt are centered nicely. And then I'll take my embroidery floss. This is all 6 strands. I chose a color that somewhat matched my ribbon. I wasn't really concerned with the felt. A little felt will peek through. I'm going to slide my ribbon again to the end of that straw. That's one of the reasons I like working with a big straw. And I'm going to go really deep here and just come up at the very edge of where the ribbon and the felt meet. And this will work on hiding that knot eventually. And now I'm just going to stitch around, and depending on how much you want to hide of your felt or how much you want exposed, you'll space your stitches. So I'm just going to go all the way around. It'll cover some of that knot, but I can always clip that as well. Again, I'm keeping my straw hidden a little bit. This way I can access it with my needle without any issue. And I know my guide is the end of that ribbon. So I'll just make all these little stitches. And then when you get to the end, after making all the stitches that you want, you can go around as many times as you want. You can make the stitches carefully placed or not. It's up to you. You can have a more haphazard look. I'm going to stitch down through the stitches, just a couple of stitches, to catch my thread. And I'll do that again a couple of times. This hides the thread and really makes the end secure. And then I will snip it. Then I'll push my bead to the other end and I'll stitch around the other end. And when I'm done stitching my bead, I just slide it off of my straw, and then I have a cute little bead here. And it slides back on to a wire or thread just as easily as it goes off. It's just a beautiful little bead. Now let me show you a couple of variations. So for the next bead, we're going to do a very similar bead, but we're going to wrap it with embroidery floss. So you create the same bead with felt, where you wrap it around. You can see my wonky stitches here. And then I'm taking a needle, and I have 3 strands of embroidery floss, 6 strands of each color. I have like a neon yellow, a yellow, and a light green, just because it happened to go nicely here. I have them on a very big tapestry needle. I'm going to come up with my tapestry needle through my felt, trying to hide my knot, so I can pull my straw down to really make that knot go in, and it'll make it a bit of a challenge to work with. And then I'm just going to wrap it. And since I have all 3 strands of 6 strands each, it really wraps quickly. When I get to the end, this might be maybe 6 inches left, I can wrap it one more time, and then I'm going to come back down through the felt and out the other end. And again, I'll play with the position of my bead on the straw, and I can come through here, and then I'll just come up again. Slide it back and just wrap it around a few times. Once it's wrapped securely, I'll go underneath the strands, come up at the edge here, and just clip those strands. And then I'll thread my needle again and wrap the ends of the bead. I'm going to clip the edge here, but not the knot. Put my straw back on, and I'll finish off the edges the same way I did. And you can see that in this bead. So that's how this bead is made. Now the last variation is just for a simple stitched bead. Again, I have the edges with the satin stitch, but then I have a very interesting bead here. So let me show you how I do that. That's a little more involved. I start with my piece of felt, and then just with whatever colors of embroidery floss, I just stitch 3/4 of that piece of felt. I could trim down the edge here if I don't want too much of a border. Just like that. And then I'm going to take my felt, and I'll start with the bare side, put that down, and then wrap it securely around, and then I have my bead. I'll stitch the edges on the back here, and I have some embroidery floss. I have just 2 strands of embroidery floss because I was trying to match this yellow, and while I didn't match the yellow, I just wanted a very light amount of color. I just wanted a very light color. So I went with 2 strands of embroidery floss, and I'll just stitch the entire piece using that same process that I used originally with the felt. Just stitching over and under, closing up that bead to keep it together. Those stitches become part of the bead, so you can take your time, or you can make it very rough and wonky. That's up to you. And when I get to the end, I'll just slide my bead down and knot it off. Maybe twice just to make it really secure. And then once again, I'd finish the edges with a satin stitch to get that beautiful edge on this bead. So these are the completed beads. You can see how they came out on the straw. I think they're adorable. Finish the edge on all of them, same technique, and then just little modifications to get a different effect. I hope you can find a use for these in your work. So that's my process for making these fabric beads. I think they're a beautiful accessory. It's a little unexpected piece to use in your slow stitching. I love the fact that they're soft and can be made with either leftover fabric or beautiful ribbon, particularly little scraps. You don't need very much fabric or ribbon to make these pieces. And you can even use embroidery floss just to make it really sharp and stand out. Very unusual, by wrapping the beads or by stitching the beads. I'm sure there are lots of viewers who have created their own fabric beads. I'd love to hear your take on this process and what processes you use that you really enjoy to make your fabric beads. Once again, thank you for joining me today. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. and please consider becoming a paid member of my channel. Thanks for joining me today.